So next we have the first speaker from our CFP. So one of those 22% from the CFP. Lauren Brennan. Lauren is a security privacy professional whose entire career has been focused on helping organizations identify gaps in their overall security posture. Today, she's going to be bringing that experience to bear on how we can make our security operations centers better. Please welcome to the stage, Lauren.
Hi, thank you all for having me here. This is my very first ever conference talk in front of people, so please be gentle. Do I need to do anything for it? Perfect, okay. So today I'm going to be talking to you guys about how to evaluate and mature your SOC using the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So a little bit about me, like Adam just said, I've been working in the cybersecurity industry for about 6 years. I've done GRC, SOC operations, and risk primarily. I'm a cat mom, an avid knitter, and a book lover. Fun fact, I have read over 350 books so far just this year alone. My record was over 1,000 in 2019. You can follow me at Litwitch on Twitter, Mastodon, Threads, Blue Sky, all the fun, social media sites. Before we get started, I want to just talk about why you actually need to evaluate your SOC. So there are 4 kind of areas in here that are really key to understanding, why should you actually look at your SOC? Why should I even think about evaluating my SOC? Doesn't my SOC just do what it's supposed to do automatically? No, not generally. The key things that you want to kind of understand for your SOC is, what am I doing well? How can I get better? What can I plan for future? So, AI, machine learning, they're coming on, new technology, new threats. How can I plan for the future for my SOC? How are we actually responding to our threats today? How are we going to respond to our threats tomorrow? And then finally, is my SOC actually aligned across all of my operations in my organization? So does my SOC work well with my IT? Do they work well with our HR teams? Do they work well just in the business generally? Is the SOC kind of, its own little pillar out in the world? Or is it actually integrated in the entire organization? So all of these things kind of give you an idea of what is needed, why you should actually evaluate your SOC. So before we really get started into the actual nitty-gritty details of my talk, I want to talk about a couple concepts called the pillars of the SOC foundations that I'll talk about as we go through. So these pillars are your operations, so your day-to-day functional activity of the SOC, analyst activities, how you actually do your work in real-world situations, your procedures, so these are your guidance, your documentation, your workflows, things that your SOC uses to guide them when they actually conduct their operations. Then you have your tooling. So this is the actual technology, the technology stack, the infrastructure that the SOC analyst leverages when they're analyzing, when they're actually responding to an incident. And then finally, collaboration. So this is where I just mentioned, how is your SOC actually interacting with the rest of your company? So how does your SOC actually interact with other parts of the organization? And then how do they interact with anything that's external, like MSP providers or vendors or contractors? So these 4 pillars are really the house, the foundation of your SOC and what your SOC is built off of. So what we're going to talk about today is this overall SOC assessment workflow, which is 4 steps pretty much. So you have your initial threat actor research using the MITRE ATT&CK TTPs. You have your SIM detections coverage mapping, so mapping your detections to that navigator, to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Then you actually have your testing of your detections. And then finally, you have your end-to-end use case review and mapping to put it all together holistically. So where does MITRE actually come into play across these 4 areas? That first step, I've already kind of talked about, MITRE is used to kind of help identify your threat actors, but it's also really key in helping you standardize your language across all aspects of your security operations center. It also helps you visualize the actual threats to your organization, as we'll see in a couple later slides. And then finally, it lets you look at those 4 pillars that I just talked about, your operations, your procedures, your technology, and your collaborations. It lets you look at all of them with the same language and the same mindset so that everybody is coming to the table with the same understanding and the same definitions when you're working together. So the very first step in actually evaluating your SOC is to identify the threats to your organization. So this is a really key step in here. And so what you want to do here is typically take about 5 to 10. You don't want to boil the ocean. You don't want to get so narrow that you're missing things. But you want to kind of identify the types of threat actors, the types of threat activity that you're most concerned about. These can be things that are, you're identified internally. So talk to your CTI team, look at your business mission. Where do you operate? Are there any location-based specific threats that you're concerned about? What is your IT team seeing, and what are they concerned about? Like Runa said in her talk, is anybody in your team a journalist? Are there some attack vectors that are going to be more important for certain parts of your organization than others? How important and how critical are those vectors going to be to your overall operations? And do you want to make sure that you are detecting and finding this behavior before it can cause a breach? So externally would be things like the Red Canary top 10 threats list that comes out every year, the Verizon DBIR report, things like Mandiant comes out with a big report, like a whole bunch of vendors come out with reports almost monthly, sometimes even weekly or daily, that talk about the threats that they are seeing. That's another really good way to leverage and to understand what threats might be occurring towards other, not competitors, but other organizations that operate in your same space. You can look and see, okay, hey, this group here was known to attack, this organization. We operate in pretty much the same space. We're not necessarily competitors, or we might be competitors, but we operate in the same space. So I want to make sure that I am also now detecting and looking at these adversaries to make sure that I can detect and defend against their behavior. So for the example for this talk, we're going to use a financial organization. They're concerned about all of these groups up here. So we have Admin 338, Indrix Spider, Lazarus, APT19, 38, and then the ransomware e-crime groups that are so common today. Exotic Lily, Fin7, TA505/CLOP, all the big ones they're concerned about. So when you take that list, this is what comes up. So it's kind of hard to see. This is the, look at the colors, not the actual details, please. So this is what it looks like when you actually map those threat actors to the navigator. The green are those techniques that those threat actors are known to be used. So this visually tells me immediately the techniques that I should be concerned about for my organization. Next step, so I have that navigator mapping, I have that visualization, that color, that list of techniques, is to say, okay, so I know what I should be detecting. What am I actually detecting? So this is where you look at both your actual data sources, your detection rules, your mitigations, things that you have that you are currently doing for your SIM, for your log analytics, your SOAR platforms. What do you have currently that you're doing? And then what isn't coming into your organization? This is a good spot here to kind of immediately see some of those gaps, to see, okay, hey, I thought that we were getting firewall logs from XYZ business organizations, in my broader enterprise. Turns out that I'm only getting 2 of the 3. Immediately there, I see a gap. And I know that if I want to detect all of this activity, if I want to detect anything related to my firewalls, I need to get business unit C into my organization, into my enterprise to detect that activity. This is where you can use that MITRE navigator to overlay your existing detections to your detections that you want to identify and see the gaps. So this is where, again, I mentioned, looking for those immediate gaps. And that looks like this. So again, lots of pretty colors. Look at the colors. The MITRE ATT&CK platform is large. It has many, many, many techniques. So visually, this gives me the chance to look and to see, okay, I know that dark green is where I have a threat actor technique that my organization right now, my enterprise, detects. Based on my understanding of what I have, my log sources, my use cases, my alerts, I can detect this type of activity. The lighter color green means that, hey, this is a technique that I can detect. It's not actually a threat actor technique, but it's still but it is still a technique that I can detect. And then therefore I can alert on this malicious behavior. And then finally, that yellow is a threat actor technique that I currently have no detection for. And again, immediately what stands out for me is that I can see where I need to prioritize building new techniques and where I need to prioritize building new detections. So this is a really easy way, well, not easy, but it's a really simple way to overlay and to say, hey, perfect. I'm concerned about these groups. I know that I can detect these techniques. When you overlap them, you can see what new techniques that you need to build detections for in order to detect that adversary behavior. If I am, concerned about CLOP, TA505, but I'm not actually able to detect any of the techniques that they're known to use, what does that do besides, make me stay up late at night, unable to sleep because I know I can't detect this activity? So this leads us into this third step here. The third step is to test your detections. So this is where you can use multiple different options here. You can either use open source, so MITRE Caldera, Atomic Red Team, a bunch of different options that are open source, or you can use some of those paid tools, Mandiant, SiteGain, some of the vendors here today do some of this stuff. And you can look to evaluate your detection capabilities. So this is where you do adversary emulation if you can. Some organizations don't have the bandwidth right now, they can't do that. But if you can, adversary emulation helps you identify the actual ability to detect this adversary behavior. So it's great that I say that I can detect a brute force, attempt on my enterprise system. But if that alert never fires, am I actually detecting it? This is where that adversary emulation comes in to give me the chance to test my detections in a safe environment without actually having an adversary come in and not realize that I can't actually detect what they're trying to, do on my systems. Like I mentioned, if it's not actually possible to do any sort of adversary emulation, even with, any of the open source ones, if your team is small, if you just don't have that much bandwidth, the next step that I suggest is to, instead of, testing via adversary emulation, is to actually look at your search language. So if you have Splunk, if you have Sumo, whatever SIM, whatever alert platform that you have, look at the actual detection language. Look to see what are the source types that it's actually pulling from. What are the log sources? What are the actual field names that are coming in for your logs? Are all of your logs sending in field names in a consistent manner? Do they all follow the same field name structure? Do they all follow the same log structure? Because if my use case is searching for a very specific field name across all of these source types, but only 3 of the 5 source types actually have that field name mapped correctly, I'm not actually searching across all of my source types. So it's important to look at your actual search language, look to see, kind of think about it, think through the searches. You might have a bunch of these, which is, going to be hard. It might take some time. So prioritize the ones that you're most concerned about and say, okay, hey, if I was an adversary, how would I try and get into the system? Can I detect that? Do I have the log sources that are detecting it? If I say yes, am I actually feeding those log sources into my use cases? Am I actually alerting on those log sources? What is my language actually looking for? Am I looking for the right things? Is there something that I might be missing? Is there something that I need to add or to build new detections for? This leads to that third bullet point there, to actually build those new detections. So on the previous slide, we looked at, there was a lot of yellow on that slide where there's techniques that the enterprise isn't really detecting right now. We don't have detections for it. This step is where you can then start building those new detections using things like Sigma, using a whole bunch of open source places where you can build languages. There's a ton of resources available for people to kind of leverage to start building new alerts and new detections if they don't have any place to start right now. And I highly recommend that if you find out when you're doing, your own assessment and you say, hey, I'm missing, 10 of these techniques, where do I start building, new alerts and new use cases? Look at Sigma, look online, just Google technique name, search use case language, and start building from there. It's very, it's not easy. None of this is really easy to do, especially from the ground up, but it's very important that you take what you're looking at. So you take your threat actors, you take your gaps, you understand, and then you actually start to try and address them, without actually addressing them, without actually building the new detections, without actually testing the detections. All this is theoretical, and you don't necessarily want it to be theoretical. You want it to actually be implemented. You want it to actually do what you're trying to do, or else what's the point? So the final kind of aspect of this whole, 4 steps is the holistic review of your workflow. So this is where you kind of look at your workflows. So how is my SOC actually analyzing? How are they actually responding to these incidents, to these alerts, to these notifications? So this is where you look at, do I have the right documentation? Is there a, communal pool or a tribal knowledge of how to actually investigate these alerts, or is this written down somewhere? If one person on my team leaves tomorrow, or they get sick, or for whatever reason they just don't answer their phone, and we get an incident, does the rest of my team know how to actually investigate that incident? If the answer is no, then you have a problem. You want to make sure that you are looking at your workflows, your documentation, your procedures, and understanding that they are written down in a central place for anybody in your organization, anybody who needs access to leverage when they're investigating an incident. This area here is really key for this kind of, procedures, your collaborations aspect, because if you don't have things written down, it kind of ends up being a mishmash. It kind of ends up being, something that, your team might just be winging it, and that doesn't help you when you're trying to respond to an incident. Here is also a good spot to actually map your MITRE techniques, to map the techniques that you're concerned about to your runbooks. Double check, make sure, okay, hey, I know that I have a brute force alert that I'm concerned about for these groups. Let me make sure that I'm tagging my documentation appropriately so that, one, my analysts can find it if they have to do a search. If there's a lot of documents, they can just search via they can search via the technique or the use case name or the alert name or the detection rule. And two, that I know that I have the coverage, that I know that my analysts know how to investigate that type of alert. They know how to investigate that technique, and they know how to escalate. So this is also where comes in kind of automation aspect. I'm not really talking about it in this slide, but this is where automation comes in. So what can be automated in your runbooks? What can be automated that reduces the workload on your team? In this little gear symbol here, your threat actors kind of push the overall, wheel the concept, for your detection and alerting, which then kind of pushes your, runbooks and your response. So if one of those gears kind of stops up, the whole thing stops up. So you want to make sure that all parts of this, overall workflow, your SOC, are well oiled and are working well together. Because if I have a use case for brute force, but it doesn't actually match what my detection is looking at, or the names are unaligned, or there's something that just is missing in the gaps, it makes it a lot harder for my SOC to actually analyze and respond to an incident in a timely manner, especially if my SOC is small, especially if I have a lot of incidents coming in a day that the SOC needs to investigate. That takes time away from the SOC actually responding to the incidents that are the most important, that are the most critical for your organization. So putting all that together, putting those 4 steps together, how do you actually use that to grow up, to mature your SOC? So one, as I keep mentioning, review your coverage and the results of your tests. Look at your tests, look at your coverage. What are your immediate gaps? What do you identify here? 2, how does the other pillars of your SOC come into play here? How is the language of, how is MITRE ATT&CK tying into your full process? Are you leveraging this standardized language that MITRE ATT&CK provides in discussions with the rest of your pillars? Are you leveraging it across your entire SOC? 3, prioritize updates. Use what we just talked about. Use that gap analysis. Use that evaluation to guide you on your future roadmap and plans. We saw all of those yellow techniques that we didn't have detections for. If you don't have the time right now to build new detections, within the next month, or, when you do it, plan those out. Say, okay, hey, we were able to detect 30 of the 50 techniques that we were concerned about. We were able to validate only 15 of those. So let's build in a roadmap. Let's build a plan for testing the rest of them, for building new detections, and then for continuing the cycle to reevaluate next year so we see where we're at next year. And then finally, talk about your threats, talk about your operations, talk about, how you're actually conducting these things, your workflows, your analysis, your communications with people. Use standard language. I recommend MITRE ATT&CK. We're talking about attack right now. MITRE ATT&CK is a really, really, really useful language for discussing threats and threat behaviors. And it's really easy to kind of both take it visually and then also get down into the really nitty gritty details. So if you're talking to somebody, say your CEO or your CISO or your CTO, you can use MITRE ATT&CK to show visually what you're concerned about and how it applies. And then also take that into another level and technically talk to your analysts about it. Talk to your engineers and your detections, and you're talking about the same thing to both parties without having to change your language necessarily. So finally, I want to talk about kind of what this example assessment and scores kind of can look like. So this is an example of, doing a self-assessment, across your 4 pillars, your operations, your procedures, your tooling. First glance score for myself, for my organization, I'm going to assume that, we are quantitatively managed, at a 4 out of 5 on the scale of 1 to 5 for our operations. I think our procedures are a 2 out of 5. I know that we don't have a lot of things documented. I know that we don't have a lot of things, written well, and there's a lot of tribal knowledge that we haven't leveraged and documented well. I think our tooling is pretty decent though. I think we're managed. I think there could be some areas that we might need to improve, we might need to reduce. And then finally, I think that we're great at collaboration. I think that we work with our CTI team, we work with IT, we work with HR fantastically. I don't think we have any problems there. When I actually go back and look at and evaluate as I go through those 4 steps, I see, hey, I'm not as great on my operations as I thought I was, but I'm still decent. I actually did better than I thought on my procedures, and tooling was actually pretty good too. We're up there. We're better than I thought I was when I actually went back and looked at it. In our collaboration, I didn't do as well as I thought I was. There's still some room for improvement in that areas. And so from that actual evaluation score, I then pivot to what I want my target score to be. So in a year from now, I want to be at 4 out of 5s for all of these different areas, and then a 5 out of 5 on collaboration. You notice that tooling didn't change. So in this case, I'm prioritizing my operations and procedures and collaboration over tooling. Tooling can stay the same, and this of course is all dependent on your organization. Budgetary constraints might mean that you might not be growing in one area and you're growing in another area too. Some things here that can be really helpful are, updating your procedures and operations. Those might take time, but they might not necessarily take a lot of money. So if you're looking for kind of more budget-friendly ways to kind of improve some things, focusing on those 2 areas might be really good. Same with collaborations. Tooling, it's a little bit harder. I'm sure we all know exactly how expensive some vendors can be. So, tooling might be something that you might have to put on the back burner. But by using the MITRE ATT&CK framework to visually understand your threats and the language and to talk about it together and to understand your gaps, that can be a really good tool for discussing with your budget overlords, how to actually, invest in some tooling areas. So final slide up here is an example of what we take where I just talked about those 4 pillars. If we apply them to the 11 strategies of a SOC book that came out a couple years ago. So this is a radar chart example roadmap using those 11 different strategy, pillars of the SOC that MITRE came out with a couple years ago. It's a great book. I highly recommend you reading it if you want to. So these go to a little bit more in depth from the 4 pillars that I just talked about. And in here, you can kind of see, we have a current state. We're not really that great on communicate clearly, collaborate often, and share generously, but I want to improve in the 24 months that I have. I might not improve it in the year 1, but I want to improve in year 2. And so this, again, gives you that visual way. It gives you that roadmap guidance for how to think about and, improve and mature your SOC using the MITRE ATT&CK framework as that baseline, as that measurement of improvement over time. And with that, oh, no, I do have one more slide. Oops. This is just a reiteration of the actual value of using the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So I keep mentioning this. Use it to build a roadmap. Look at your gaps. Look at what you have that you're missing, and build a roadmap to kind of plan and structure it out so you know how to improve. It's guiding you on your overall improvements. Use it to identify your gaps. Validate your detections and your IR processes. If you don't validate, how do I know I can actually detect things? If it never fires, am I sure it's actually detecting what I want it to detect? Or is an adversary in my system and I just don't know it because my alerts have never actually fired? And then finally, use the MITRE ATT&CK framework as the standardized language for thinking about security operations in your entire organization, cross-platform, across your organization. The MITRE ATT&CK framework provides a great language for discussing threats and adversary behaviors that you can use to communicate with the rest of the organization. And with that, thank you.
So we do have a couple minutes for questions, but I also just wanted to thank you. And can we get an extra special round of applause for your first presentation? Killed it.
Thank you.
So before we go around the room, I selfishly do have a question. And I love the way you connected back to the keynote about knowing your audience, and through this process of, I love what you outlined it of, look at where we are, look at what we expect, where are we really, but where do we need to go? I really agree that throughout that process, you find improvements, you find gaps, you find additional things you can do. But what are your thoughts on, exactly to your point about how much expensive this could be, and it could come off as an audit and maybe come off as a little bit nasty? How do you get organizations to take that first step? It might seem a little bit scary, a little bit daunting to really dive into this.
Yes. So the first kind of part of that is basically kind of communicating with them that, hey, this is not an audit. You're not meant to find problems when you're doing this, when you're looking at your SOC. You're meant to kind of validate what you're doing currently and find gaps, find areas that you can improve, but it's not meant to kind of be a detriment. You're not meant to come in and be like, you're doing so badly in this area that you should feel bad about yourself. It's a, hey, you're doing good in a lot of these areas, but there are some areas that you might not have seen before that you could improve. So I go back to that tribal knowledge, that that knowledge that you might have in your enterprise question, or not question, but statement. If you've worked in your SOC for a long time and everybody in your SOC just generally knows what to do and how to do things, you might not immediately see that not having things documented might be a gap. So being able to kind of take a step back and look at it, it's a collaborative approach with your SOC. It's a collaborative approach with your security operations. You never want to come in and say, I'm here to tell you what you're doing wrong and why and what you need to fix. It's I'm here to help you figure out what you're doing well, and then what you might not have seen yet that you can do to improve, and then how that can kind of guide you and lead you. And then the budget consideration comes into there, is where you say, okay, hey, look, I know budget's a problem for almost everybody. I know there's been, a lot that's kind of, financially to consider lately. That's where you come in and you're like, okay, so then what can we do now that doesn't necessarily need a lot of budget? So things like updating your documentation. This can be done in your downtime. If you have an intern, if you have somebody that's new on your team and they don't really know a lot of things, it's probably worthwhile to have them come in and talk with all of your senior analysts and kind of just document what they know and how they're doing it. And then that, that's a pretty easy way to make it some significant improvements. And then down the line, if you get more budget, if you're planning, if you use the roadmap to kind of say, hey, this is where we want to go and this is how we're going to get there, that gives you a much better way to talk about your budget with your leadership, besides just saying, hey, we want to invest in this new great tool or this new great log source because it's going to help us detect things. Well, how do you show that? How do you actually discuss that and talk with them? And so this, having the roadmap, having the actual gap analysis, lets you talk about that and lets you lead that conversation.
That's an excellent point, where our budget overlords, they're people too.
Yes.
So the better we can help them understand the problem and actually, to your point, do our homework and present a meaningful data-driven approach of, I'm not just spending money, I'm actually improving the organization. Excellent points.
Yeah.
Wanted to open up to the crowd. Any questions? I do have another one packed away, but I don't want to monopolize the time here. Oh, over here.
Yes.
So much so that we considered, does that need to be another spectrum sort of metadata that we capture? Have you seen that challenge of coverage sort of dealt with at scale, or any thoughts around how to address that, where certain parts of the world do have coverage, certain parts don't, and how do we keep that out at large?
Just to repeat for the online audience, the question is basically, how do you deal with the inevitable it depends of coverage, where sometimes it's covered, sometimes it's not, it might be a bit of a gradient. How do you deal with that, logically, but also scale that out to full SOC assessments?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways that I would recommend kind of maybe taking this. So first way is separating by business unit initially. So if your business units operate completely different areas, like say you're a large umbrella organization, say that you have a business unit that operates only in Asia and they're a legal aspect, and say you have another, business unit that only operates in South America and they're, news organization or something like that, they're going to have completely different concerns for threat actors, and so your enterprise, you want to kind of roll those up for your enterprise to say, okay, hey, so here's all of the techniques that my entire enterprise is concerned about, but then individually in my business units, let's break it down and let's look at that business unit and kind of branch it out. So you have your umbrella, and then you kind of have your, business unit, your pillars underneath it, the raindrops, the metaphor kind of wonky there, but then you can look at those individual business units and then roll that up from there. So taking the it depends. I mean, yes, it depends. As you know, the context is key and important for all of the detections that you have. But by going as deep as you can to your business unit level, to the actual kind of teams or the location that you're concerned about, and then looking at the threat actors that are relevant to that specific area for all of your areas, and then rolling it up to the entire enterprise, so you can say, okay, hey, in business units A, B, C, and D, we're all concerned about one specific. They're all concerned about one specific threat actor. So I want to make sure that enterprise, we're really focused on that. But business units A and C are concerned about this other one, and B and D are concerned about this other one there. So they're still important, but we want to make sure that we have that coverage, and we want to make sure that we have the source types and the log sources and the detections for those business units. But they might not be not as important, but they might not be like as critical as the ones that are affecting all 4 of my business units. Does that answer your question? Does that provide some good? Okay, awesome.
Thank you so much. A small token of our appreciation, and congrats again.
Thank you so much.